From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Met police officer who shot a man through the windscreen of a car has been cleared of murder. 40-year-old Martin Blake told an Old Bailey jury he feared for his colleagues' lives after Chris Cabba refused to get out of the vehicle in 2022. The Audi was linked to a shooting in another part of South London. Dao Babu is a former chief superintendent and told LBC he's not surprised by the verdict.
I think what you had in terms of evidence is a vehicle that Chris Cabba was driving that had been involved in a shooting the day before. The officers at that stage didn't know who was driving it. It had refused to stop for police, and at that point the police officer has said that he felt the life of his colleagues was in danger.
The Prime Minister says NHS workers have a once-in-a-generation chance to change the service. Staff and patients are being asked to take part in a survey on the future of the NHS in England. A woman's admitted assaulting Nigel Farage by throwing a milkshake over him. Victoria Thomas-Bowen also pleaded guilty to criminal damage following the incident in Clacton-on-Sea. And UK banks paid a record amount in taxes last year. UK Finance says the sector's total contribution to HMRC was £44.8 billion. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 40 points at 83.18. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.19. LBC weather: rain clearing in the southeast this evening, further showers in the north and west, and a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Many of you work in it. Even more, if not all of you, have been treated by it or relied, and I refer to the NHS, and I want to hear your views. John in Manchester.
I am a clinical psychologist. We are rushed off our feet continuously, and unfortunately we don't have the resources or the staff to do the job that we want to do for our service users.
Helen is in Dorking.
I'm a retired nurse of 35 years. My youngest son at the moment, he's 24. He's at a university on the south coast, and he went to the university doctors last week. First appointment is the 4th of November.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7.
With Betfair, where odds move faster than polls. Play responsibly.
LBC. This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to Monday's Cross Question. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. With me in the studio for this hour, we have Richard Tice, the Deputy Leader of Reform UK, MP for Boston and Skegness. Justine Greening, founder of social mobility campaign The Purpose Coalition, a former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Next to her, Dr. Jonathan Romain, writer, social campaigner and rabbi who leads the Religious Alliance for Dignity in Dying, which calls for a change in the law on assisted dying. And hot foot from a studio 2 floors above, Emily Thornberry is here. She is the Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury and the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. They are here to take your calls and your messages. 0345 6060 973 on the phones and WhatsApp, 84850 on the text. And we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's start with the text question from Scott in West Hampstead. The government has announced that they want a big conversation about the future direction of the NHS. Didn't David Cameron have a big conversation? This is nothing new, is it? About the future direction of the NHS, and they're seeking the views of patients and NHS employees. But doesn't the government already know what needs to be fixed within the NHS and is carrying out this big conversation, not just another example of kicking the can down the road? Well, Emily Thornberry, we've had the Darzai report, we've had your election manifesto. I mean, what else do we need to know?
Well, I think the truth is that we are starting to do some important things, like we fixed the junior doctor strike. We've got some best practice, which is because we needed to increase the number of appointments by 40,000. So there are some doctors who've got good practice when it comes to helping people to work at weekends in the evening, and they're being asked to now go around the country and introduce that best practice around the place so that we can tackle the 40,000. We've got policies when it comes to vapes and tobacco, which is picking up the ball that was dropped by the Conservatives and moving on with that. There's going to be legislation coming in this week by Peter Kyle, which is going to be about data and how we will be able to share patient data and information across the NHS to making it more efficient, but nevertheless having proper control. So there's a number of things that they're doing, and obviously watch the budget and see what happens in relation to funding. But we need a 10-year plan, that we have certain things that we want to do, but we also... Do you know what? Good politicians listen to the public and learn from the public. And learn.
You have had 4 years to do that in opposition.
Yeah, and as I say, well, I've just given you a list of some of the things that we're going to do. So we don't have everything, and actually we believe that very often listening and learning from the public, and also from people who work in the NHS and who have some very good ideas, and those ideas quite often don't end up on the Secretary of State's desk. And he'd like to hear from people, and he'd like to hear some of the ideas that people have.
Richard Tice.
Well, I think you said it as at the beginning, Ian. I mean, the government, the current government has had basically 14 years to work this out, and the Health Secretary during the election campaign and before was pretty clear in his strategy.
Yeah.
And I mean, fundamentally, I think we know what people want, and that is to get the waiting list down and to improve the quality of outcomes in critical areas like cancer care, where we're amongst the worst in the Western world. And the Health Secretary said he was going to use a lot more of the independent sector in order to get the waiting list down. That seems to have gone very quiet. The Darzai report was quick, was rapid, was pretty shocking. I spoke with the Health Secretary about that in the Commons, and there was a recognition there's far too much management, far too much bureaucracy that's blocking things. And I think, in a sense, it's now not for a public conversation. I mean, Emily's right that clearly great people on the front line have ideas how to improve outcomes quicker and reduce timeframes and things. But I think the public just say, please just get on with it and get it sorted. And in the nicest possible way, we can't wait 10 years. I think we'd like to wait about 6 to 12 months. I appreciate I'm an ambitious guy.
Can I just like newsflash? We're not going to fix the NHS in 6 months.
I know.
I mean, we're not. And it is something that we
don't need to wait 10 years.
And we need to, no. And it is a job that needs to take 10 years. We will be working on it throughout that period. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to surprise people with policies that have not been, in a manifesto. I mean, listen, when I first, in 2010, when we first went into opposition, I remember spending 3 months of my life that I'm never going to get back on the Health and Social Care Act, because, you had a health minister who turned up with a plan in his pocket that he hadn't told anybody about, and he then produced this legislation that I remember spending 3 months of my life trying to change, because the Health and Social Care Act was a terrible piece of legislation and was a total distraction from what was needed in the health service.
The most important thing to rapidly improve the quality of outcomes and reduce waiting lists is a recognition within senior leadership of hospitals and NHS England in particular that actually the management's got to change, and they've got to be prepared to consider anything in order to hasten outcomes.
Yeah, but that's what Lansley wanted to do, and it was a complete disaster.
I wonder how much the politicians in charge of this and the senior management in the NHS actually will listen to the consequences of this big conversation. When I was in hospital in the summer, I said to one of the nurses, I said, well, what would you do to fix things? And she said, well, grade 2 nurses and grade 5 nurses basically run this hospital. We could do without most of the other grades. Now, I wonder if I did actually tell West Streeting that anecdote, but I wonder how much of that kind of message ever gets through to cabinet ministers. Well, let's ask one, former cabinet minister, Justine Greening.
I think sometimes those messages often do get through. I think what you need is, what this government will need to do is a combination of some immediate quick wins and getting on with some of those, I think, points that Richard's made, which is the plans to actually bear down on the challenges today's NHS faces. But I also think that what Wes Streeting was talking about today was sensible. There are shifts that we need to see happen in the NHS, from a really analogue version of the NHS to a more digital one, from one that you have to go to hospital to get probably too much treatment, to one that's more on my doorstep. Desperately needs to shift to a version of the NHS that's preventing people from getting ill rather than just treating it. I think all of that is more of a profound change in practice for the NHS than people realise. It means big changes for where you get your healthcare, who's providing it. It means big changes for public health and where that sits. And so I think it's very constructive to engage the public. What they will want to see, though, is that conversation translate into clear strategy that is going to improve the services people have on their doorstep. I do think the government needs to be extremely careful about what this means for elderly people who aren't online, want to literally go to a local GPs and see their doctor. I think in a sense, the devil will be in the detail, and you can't have this one-size-fits-all version of the NHS, because there will be, I think, for the foreseeable future, certainly some people that find it hard to access if it goes entirely online. But I mean, my final advice, I guess, my final advice to the government would be to absolutely crack on, because it feels today like you've got a long time ahead of you, 4.5 years plus. It will be remarkably quickly eaten up, and therefore there is, yes, have a conversation with the public, but, then it comes a time when you have to make some decisions, and I think you need to move on to that sooner rather than later.
Jonathan Romain, as the only non-politician on this panel, or former politician, what do you make of this?
Well, I must admit I was very puzzled, because I actually expected Wes Streeting to be a man with a plan, not with a man with lots of question marks. I assumed that he'd done that in opposition and prepared the way. Certainly I go to a lot of hospitals as a chaplain. I'm a chaplain to 4 hospitals. And, as we all know, it's variable. Some parts of it are brilliant, particularly the emergency services. On the wards, it's pretty awful, and we know the hospital waiting times, or diagnostic times, or treatment times really are atrocious. And I think one of the problems, and it's to do with the bigger issue of social care. And a lot of people who are elderly and who, in the nicest possible way, clogging up the system, because they actually don't need medical treatment. What they need is social care. And at the moment, they are being put into wards, whereas actually it should be either care at home or in care homes. And we've got to do better. And I know the government and the opposition, actually, for that matter, have both been talking about it. But, they've been talking about it for an awfully long time, and we've got to sort out the social care system to actually help the NHS do the sort of the medical and the treatment side.
Emily, do you think it helps when Wes Streeting describes the NHS as broken? Because it has been said or alleged that that's quite debilitating for NHS staff. And we all judge the NHS, I suppose, by our own experiences. And my experience certainly has been very positive over the last few months. But there'll be lots of other people listening who don't have that same experience. But is it right to basically say the whole system's broken?
I think that people quite appreciate the honesty of that. When I've spoken to NHS workers, it doesn't take very long for them to, if you're talking to them about their experience over the last few years, for them to get really quite distressed. And I don't think that the NHS has got over the pandemic yet. And I think also that the NHS was that much more vulnerable because of so many years of cuts, essentially, to the NHS, so that when a big pandemic hit it, they were already stretched to breaking point anyway, and the waiting lists have gone up, and people feel it doesn't matter how hard they work, they can't keep up. So we do need to have a plan. I mean, can I just say, just like, put you guys out of your misery. I mean, the idea is to, in the spring of 25, to put forward a plan for the NHS and for social care. But we do want to listen to the public first.
OK, well, let's take a slightly early break, because we've got 2 very important subjects to cover in the next part of the programme. It's coming up to 14 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
When you
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
This is one of those panels where I think I can introduce everybody with just their name. I don't really need to say what they put them into context because you all know who they are. Emily Thornberry, Richard Tice, Justine Greening and Dr. Jonathan Romain. Let's go to our next caller. It is Keon in Southwark. Keon, hello. What would you like to ask?
Hello, hi. I was waiting to call in, but thank you so much for letting me speak, giving me the opportunity. I wanted to ask, basically, if we're not going to go forward with the repopulation for the Caribbean countries, what can we do in the now? What can we do now to sort of like make the system fairer, especially the immigration system for all people of Caribbean nationalities?
What? I'm not sure I see the link. So you're saying if we don't proceed with reparations,
yes,
we should effectively change the immigration system to allow more people from the Caribbean into the country?
We do, not just that, but the ones who are here, basically, what are we going to do to make the system fairer for them? Are we going to be, because we've got thousands of immigrants here, basically undocumented as well, with the Windrush scandal, that was it was like a big slap in the face as well, basically. So what are we going to put in place for these people to make them legal into the system?
Okay. All right, Keon, I think we've got the message. Justine Greening.
I think it's a really important point that all these years after the Windrush scandal, actually, there are still many people affected by it who haven't had due compensation, and I think in some cases still remain, as it were, in limbo in terms of what their circumstances are. I certainly had a constituent who was affected by it, and it was absolutely shocking that somebody who was here for decades could suddenly have a question mark raised over whether they had a right to remain. I think in relation to immigration, it's a really interesting question post-Brexit, whether you have a different approach for Commonwealth countries that we have closer ties with, both historically but also today. My sense is, in the end, you just have to have a fair immigration that works for everyone, irrespective of which country they're wanting to come here from. And I think it has to work fairly for Britain, perhaps first of all. But I do think we just talked about some of the backlogs in the NHS system. I do think there's a legacy challenge in the immigration system that has dramatically worsened over the past Parliament. And frankly, the sooner, for everyone's sake, that we can address that, the better. I don't think it's healthy for a country to have so many people here who've got their situation unresolved and for whom the timelines on doing that are simply never-ending from what I can make out. We have to get a grip on the immigration system at the same time as making it fairer.
Richard Tice.
Yeah, at every level, actually, just picking up on what Justine said, competence is the key word. Many people clearly with the Windrush scandal were let down by a failure to process people properly, a failure to recognise if people have been here for decades. That's got to be dealt with competently and rapidly. Then you've got the issue of people who've arrived here undocumented, illegally. Their applications for asylum should be processed rapidly, competently, as it was 20 years ago under the previous Labour government, when people were given an assessment within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, given a rapid appeal, and then a decision made. And then those in having a competent, smart immigration legal system that works for both sides of the equation, that works for the host nation, works for British citizens, as well as those coming into the country. And that, I think, is what we've got to do. At the moment, we've had under the previous government incompetence at every level. And the result is absolute chaos that doesn't work for anybody. Most of all, I believe, for the British economy and the British people.
What about the issue of reparations? Because today it's come up again because various Caribbean countries are, I think, going to put in claims for massive reparations from this country, and maybe others as well. Do you think there is any kind of case for that?
No, not whatsoever. There's no case or place for it at all. I mean, let's just remember, we should, I think, celebrate the role that we played, actually, in stopping the slave trade, which was awful, and we paid for it in both blood and in money. And we should say, actually, we led the way in stopping that horror. Of course, bad things happened.
We also led the way in the slave trade. I mean, let's not forget that.
No, we didn't actually. Many nations, including African nations, were all involved in an absolute horror.
That is true.
So all sorts of bad things.
Portugal, I think we were the highest number of slaves.
You can't turn the clock back. What you can do is recognise that we were the first people actually to actively stop it, and that is a thing that we should recognise and celebrate and move forward. We are where we are today. It's not about reparations, it's about having a sensible, smart immigration system that works for the United Kingdom, works for our economy and works for our people.
Apparently Haiti was the first country to stop it, so I'm told. If I don't say that, I'm going to get loads of texts from people saying, why didn't you correct him? It's Haiti. Jonathan Romain.
I'm always a little bit unsure when people talk about reparations, because how far do you go back? I mean, do we blame the French for colonising the Anglo-Saxons in 1066? I mean, that sounds a bit spurious, but, how far do you take these things back? I think what's much more important is how we treat them now, and whether it's, the anti-racism legislation, equal opportunities for people of all backgrounds and colours and faiths. And by that, I don't just mean the government. It's very easy just to shift this all to the government and legislation. I mean ordinary people. I mean people who are listening to this programme right now, and whether they actually will be equal in the way they treat prospective employees, the way they treat people in the desk opposite them in the work or in the factory, the way they integrate other people in their social circles. So it's not just legislation, it's also about us and how we see other people.
Emily.
I think you're right, and I think actually that's in a way what I think Keon has been saying too. If we're not going to pay reparations for slavery, then shouldn't we be working that much harder at making life a bit fairer particularly for people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds? And I mean, let me just say, because I think that this evening in this debate, I think it's been forgotten that actually in 2007, Tony Blair did apologise for
I pointed that out earlier in the programme.
Good. Well, on another channel they weren't. I should have been here, clearly.
Now, what does that teach you?
I know. What was I thinking? But just, on a serious note, I think that we can't pretend that we do live in a society where people are treated equally. I mean, if you just look at the death rate of pregnant mothers who are black in Britain, it doesn't matter what their class background is, you're more likely to die in childbirth and in pregnancy if you're black in Britain than if you're white in Britain.
And more likely to have an abortion.
Yeah. But I mean, it's
for economic reasons.
Yeah, and but also, what is wrong with the system in the way that it's treating black mothers that more of them die? That's the point. And sometimes you can say, oh well, it depends. We're richer women are more likely to be able. No, doesn't matter what doesn't matter how rich you are. If you're black, you're more likely. So it's just a straw. It's just a straw in the wind that just shows the level. The other bit I think about the Windrush, and it's been mentioned that people don't talk about enough, is from my constituents when I spoke to them who'd been brought over to this country as children with their parents and had never had appropriate documentation. They knew they didn't have national insurance numbers, or when they realised they didn't say, oh my goodness, I better get in touch with the authorities and get it sorted out. The fact that they didn't shows a lack of confidence that the British state would have treated them fairly. And lo and behold, the British state didn't treat them fairly. I mean, I just think that speaks volumes. I do think we need to pull ourselves up sometimes and think a little more about the way in which we treat ethnic minorities, and we get smug about it, and we think Britain is so much better than so many other countries in the way that we treat people.
Which we are. We're not. But there's always lessons to learn. You can always get better.
We have a long way to go.
Don't beat yourselves up unnecessarily.
No, don't beat yourself up unnecessarily, but be truthful with yourself when you can see evidence that actually people and it's right. People come here and if they want to get their immigration status sorted out, it can take years, and it's like they're standing there holding their breath, waiting for their life to be able to begin. And most of them will get their immigration status sorted out, and they will be able to remain in this country, but we don't have a system which is firm or fair or fast, and we need to make sure that we do for the sake of all of us.
Right, let's move on to a text question from Paul in Norwich, who says, was Labour right to settle with the unions and strengthen workers' rights? Now, with MPs discussing the Employment Rights Bill today, I think you're voting on it later, aren't you? The Department for Business has released its impact assessment for the policy, which says it would cost the economy almost £5 billion a year, but claims that the economic benefits through improving workers' well-being and therefore their productivity will end up adding to more than £5 billion a year. Richard Tice.
Well, I have to say that small businesses, big businesses, medium businesses, I think are really worried about this legislation. And that's what I'm getting in my post bag, where people are saying, you know, the balance of risks and rewards of employing people, taking a risk, is going the wrong way. And it's a terrible place for a government that's trying to grow the economy quite rightly. If you get this balance wrong and people don't take that extra risk as a small business, don't employ more people, then it's going to achieve exactly the opposite of what's intended. So this is going to go through with the majority it's got, but I think it's going too far, and that's why I'll be voting against it.
Which bit in particular do you object to?
It's cumulative. Lots of little cumulative bits mean that people end up saying, it's not worth the risk of employing people. It's not worth the risk of working that extra bit harder, and you say each little bit, well, that's not too bad, but cumulatively, it just tips people over the edge, and that's the message I get from, particularly from small businesses, 5 to 15 to 20 to 30 people.
Because when there's been changes in employment law in the past, they tended to only affect bigger businesses, and small businesses were exempt from a lot of the things. But under these proposals, I think small businesses, even if you only employ one person, that person on day one gets rights which they wouldn't have had before. Is that the problem?
It's exactly the problem. And so you end up, all of a sudden, you've always got to have a sort of an HR person sort of looking over your shoulder. Can I do this? Can I do that? And that's a terrible way to be running a small business.
Jonathan.
Well, I'm not familiar with the legislation, but I do have both employers and employees in my congregation, and I know they're a little bit worried either way, because in principle, workers' rights is good. I mean, why not? Of course. The problem is unintended consequences, and I'm thinking particularly of some really, as Richard said, some small businesses, and whether they can take on the extra responsibilities. But also from a worker's point of view, I know that 0 hours, for instance, have been disastrous for some people, but actually there's other people who really like it because it fits in with their lifestyle. It gives them the freedom to do this and not do that. And I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that it's a very sensitive area. And I know, for instance, my own son will be devastated if 0 hours now becomes banned, because he's actually used that very effectively.
Okay. Emily?
I hear you, but I have to say my kids are doing, when lots of jobs that they've done on the basis of 0 hours that I used to have a contract on. You know, so when I worked in a pub, I used to work particular nights, and and I knew those nights I was working, and I was able to organise my life around them. Whereas when my daughter was working in a pub, she used to get rung up, you know, that morning. No, we want you in tonight. No, not tomorrow. No, we've changed our minds. And it was like they owned her, you know, for the pittance that they were paying her. And that is too often people's experience. And this is just about resetting the balance, I think. We need to make work pay. We need to have happy workers. It will help our economy. And yeah, it might cost, you know, $5 billion, but that's only 0.5% of the total bill that, the total amount that people are paid out in wages. It's only a little increase. And if it means that people can get sick pay, if it means that dads can take parental leave, if it means that...
From day one.
Yeah, that we're treating people fairly, then
Emily,
what's wrong?
Employers won't take the risk of employing people from day one if they think that day 3 they're off on a sickie and they're gone for a month. It just won't happen.
I mean,
those are some of the biggest risks that I think we overstep the mark.
I mean, I remember when we introduced the minimum wage, and we got an awful lot of complaints, and the economy was going to grind to a halt and nobody was going to be employed and so on. And actually, you know, in fact, they were entirely reasonable measures, just like these are. And, you know, when this is not going to, the sky will not fall down if a dad can take a bit of time off to spend some time with their baby.
How many people in the current Labour cabinet have ever worked or run a business?
Don't know.
None.
Really?
Isn't that a problem?
I don't know that. I don't know. Well, I mean, I think the important thing is that that we listen to the public and we learn. I mean, as I said earlier, it's the same with the health service. How many people in the cabinet have run the health service before? Obviously not. And so we need to make sure that we listen to experts and listen to those involved. And
in which case, take 6 months of you're going to do with the health service, listen to employers for longer about some of these issues, and come up with some suitable opt-outs and carve-outs and exemptions.
Well, I think there are quite a lot of carve-outs, and I think it is a balancing act between what what organised labour wants and what the employers want. And we've spent a great deal of time listening to both sides on this, and this is the compromise, and we think that it's going to make Britain better.
Okay, Justine.
I think, first of all, done right, this should go hand in hand with supporting economic growth. There's no doubt about that. Happy workers lead to better performing companies. I do think Labour, though, needs to be careful with the extra burdens it is going to put on some businesses, particularly small ones. I think that's just a fact, and I think it's a risk that does need to be really carefully managed by the government. I also think it probably needs to look more carefully about how it can literally work with SMEs to help them grow. I mean, in a sense, the danger with these debates is you look at, if you like, the downside that does need to be managed. On day one rights and all of that, although I think there's a lot of merit in giving people the certainty of what their rights are when they join an employer. But I don't think there's probably enough support for businesses to be able to grow. I mean, it's literally a key in like my former constituency was full of SMEs. We didn't have big employers. And yet actually, how do they get access to capital? How do they get access to the advice to grow, to create jobs? So I think there's another part of this that is easy to miss, but absolutely crucial if you're really going to have a growing, thriving economy. We don't talk enough about entrepreneurship. We don't talk enough about young people in our schools finding out how to start a business, what that means. We don't have enough pathways through for them. They are asked to do academic routes or maybe vocational routes, but always working for someone else. So I think if this can trigger a broader debate about entrepreneurship and how to support it, then maybe that's a good thing to come out of it.
We're going to hear from the budget in whatever it is, 9 days' time, but I fear that the budget is going to increase taxes on small businesses. It's going to reduce the incentive to taking risk. Taking risk and growing a small business is a great thing. Making money as a successful entrepreneur is a great thing that we should celebrate and not be resentful for. And I think we've got a real cultural problem. And I fear that if the Chancellor gets the balance wrong, alongside this, then the incentive to take risk and grow and be successful goes the wrong way.
Well, we haven't got long to wait. We will take more of your calls and questions in just a moment. It's 8:32. News time on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
A police officer has been cleared of murdering an unarmed man he shot in the head in South London 2 years ago. Martin Blake shot Chris Cabba during a police vehicle stop in Streatham in September 2022. The car was connected to a firearms incident the night before. West Streeting's begun a consultation on the future of the health service, promising to put patients and staff at the heart of his 10-year plan. The Health Secretary says the NHS is going through the worst crisis in its history. And a woman who threw a milkshake over Reform UK MP Nigel Farage has pleaded guilty to assault. 25-year-old Victoria Thomas Bowen from Clacton-on-Sea told police she didn't agree with his political views. LBC weather: rain clearing in the southeast this evening, further showers in the north and west through the night, a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC.
As a
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Emily Thornberry, Richard Tice, Justine Greening and Dr. Jonathan Romain here answering your questions. Now, here's an interesting one from Julie in, it doesn't actually say where she is. Is the idea of two-tier policing any more than a mad conspiracy theory? Now, the family of Chris Cabba claimed the acquittal of an armed police officer who'd been accused of murdering the unarmed man in 2022. I don't know why we keep describing him as an unarmed man. Yes, he may not have had a gun, but he did try and ram a police roadblock, is a sign that the justice system does not treat black people fairly. Richard Tice, you've been talking about this today, I gather.
I have, in a different context. I asked about two-tier policing, two-tier justice. Look, I think on this particular case, look, frankly, I don't think it should have gone to trial in the first place, but it's gone to trial, the jury's reached a verdict, and our armed forces have to make split-second judgments, and as you just touched on in this situation, here was a man who was trying to evade arrest over some period of time in a car that had been involved in an armed incident the night before. So I'm surprised it went to trial, but I am genuinely worried about two-tier justice. We've got a situation where, if you say and do and write something daft and inappropriate and wrong on social media and delete it a couple of hours later, you can go to jail for 2 years in this country. But actually, if you assault a police officer in an airport, brutally, violently, break their noses, 4 months later, you still haven't been charged. And I think that is two-tier policing and two-tier justice. And I think that's really upsetting people.
If there was some sort of conspiracy about that, it would
I don't think it's conspiracy.
But some police forces do things one way, some police forces do things another. That doesn't really meet the definition of two-tier, does it? It just means that one's more competent than the other.
Well, but it's the CPS who makes the decision whether or not to prosecute. And if you've got video evidence of someone standing and shouting at a police officer, and you say, well, that's the video evidence, arrest, charge, convict and sentence, that can happen in a matter of 2 weeks. Why can't it happen in this other instance where someone literally floors an officer, brutally assaults them, you've got the video evidence, no one's explained to me.
So what's behind it?
I don't know. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, I'm just saying what is going on? That must be two-tier justice under the CPS. They need to explain themselves, frankly, because trust in policing and our justice system is really important, and I fear that it's ebbing away.
Emily Thornberry, in a former life you were a barrister, your husband's a judge. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I keep my husband out of this. It's not his fault.
Sorry, as soon as I said it, I thought that was unfair.
I think there's a lot going on here. So I think the first thing is that in relation to Chris Cabba, it was a really difficult decision to make. You hardly ever get police officers charged with manslaughter or murder where someone has died having been in contact, to use as neutral a phrase as possible, with the police. It happens very rarely indeed, and it's a very difficult decision to make. And quite clearly there was what's called prima facie evidence. There was evidence that looked like on the balance of probabilities there was a chance that there would be a conviction, and that's why the Crown Prosecution Service made that decision. And then it's checked. There are checks and balances. It's checked when it goes to trial, because at the end of the prosecution case, it's up to the defence, but the defence can ask the judge to chuck it out if there isn't enough evidence to go all the way. So this was a case, it looks like, where there was sufficient evidence to convict, and it was a matter for a jury. And then thank goodness for the common sense of juries who come in, and they are our experts in common sense. They have much more common sense than any of us, and certainly more than most lawyers. And we bring them in because of their experience of life, and they're the ones who make the decision. And sometimes they convict and sometimes they acquit. And it's very, very hard for a family who have lost someone in the circumstances in which Chris Cabba's family have lost, Chris. But it is one, and tonight we're in circumstances where we've had armed police officers, threatening to essentially go on strike because the defendant was charged, and on the other hand, we have a community grieving and saying it's not fair that he wasn't convicted. These are very difficult circumstances, and personally, I think that it is incumbent on politicians to try and hold communities together and not use rhetoric and to try to divide us further.
Justine.
And that's why the rule of law and people being equal under the rule of law matters so much in that due process, because there is only one way in the end you can prove to people that everybody has had a same fair shot in the justice system, and that is trial by jury and a clear process that everyone goes through irrespective of who they are.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is sometimes now is that there are some cases that are extremely high profile, and I think when that happens, the police take extra care. And I guess one of the challenges that then happens is possibly it feels like there's feet dragging and it's taking longer than it needs to, when in fact actually what's happening is people are just trying to absolutely make sure that if a case gets brought to court, it doesn't fail because, if you like, the previous process to build the case has not been done effectively. But I don't think there is two-tier policing. But I do think there are some areas where sentencing feels like it's out of kilter depending on what the crime is. And I think that's an issue for Parliament, isn't it, in many respects, to periodically review the balances between different crimes in a different age and see whether that balance stays in the right place.
The sentences that were meted out to people involved in the riots, for example, they do look punitive in comparison to other cases that have happened of a similar nature. But they
weren't of a similar nature. That's the whole point. They weren't of a similar nature in the context of riots that were happening where, it was a threat to the stability of the nation. This wasn't just like, Saturday night and a few people getting drunk and smashing some windows. This was, This was an uprising that was happening around the country with different communities.
Yeah, and the sentences meant that they didn't do it again.
Bluntly, it was political sentencing. And, what is worse? Is it worse standing outside somewhere with...
What do you mean political sentencing?
This was sentencing with a political purpose done very, very rapidly.
Well, the purpose was to stop the riots.
Well, and so exactly.
And provide a deterrent.
So you've just agreed with me that it's political sentencing.
Well, it
was a political judgment. It was a political judgment to stop the riots.
Involved in it.
It was up to our Prime Minister stood up at a press conference and said people will be dealt with very harshly.
Good.
And gave a...
That's what I expected.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but it was political sentencing. And that sentencing was harsher than people, than, for example, sex offenders. So, that comes back to confidence in the system, confidence in sentencing, confidence in the justice system.
But, Emily, sorry, Jonathan, I'm bringing you in a second. Emily, what do you make about Richard's theory here, that there is a sort of wider two-tier policing or wider two-tier justice system?
I think it's just nonsense.
I think what I would like to understand, Richard, is, are you saying that if someone has a political motivation for rioting, then they should get a lesser sentence?
I'm not saying that at all. No, absolutely not. No, don't misunderstand me. Emily's right. You've got to stop the rioting. And so there was a very clear mandate: get them arrested, get them charged, get them sentenced. But what we're left with is a degree of sentencing where you say, how's that comparable? Because you've done and said something ridiculous and daft and bad on social media that you've apologised for and taken down 2 hours later, as opposed to literally sex offenders not being sent to jail, not being dealt with appropriately. That's where people have a loss of confidence.
Except this was a highly volatile situation. It wasn't political or punitive. It was preventative, wasn't it? What were the alternatives? Calling out the army and the militia. And I think actually it had widespread support. By the way, going back to the original question,
bringing back hanging would have widespread support. That's not an argument.
No, but it was a fact. Okay, well, it worked. Let's put it that way. It was a very stark warning to everybody else who might have done copycat. And that's a great deal danger with these sort of things. The copycat effect. It was stopped right in the track, very effectively.
So you've all actually agreed with me that this was political sentencing with an objective.
It was about combating a broader sense of disorder and threat to public person and property.
Which is a political judgment. My complaint is...
that's not a political judgment. That's just about having law and order in the country. That's not politics. That's law and order. And I think no political party would take a different perspective on this.
Is your complaint, Richard, that when you talk about people putting things on social media that are stupid and they apologise for and they take it down a few hours later, are you talking about incitement? Are you talking about incitement to violence? Are you talking about putting up stuff that's that's encouraging people to go out and riot?
I'm talking about
undermine the stability of our country. Because if that's what you just think is just stupid and they shouldn't have been punished, then I think you're on another planet, mate.
well, I'm not on another planet, I'm on this planet, and let's be clear, is that appropriate to send someone to jail for 2 or 3 years?
For incitement?
For 2 or 3 years. And if the judgment is yes, well, that's the country we now live. That's a very serious political judgment.
I thought you believed in harsh sentences and deterrence, but apparently not on this issue.
No, I do believe in harsh sentences and deterrence, but it's about consistency. And what we're clearly seeing is there isn't consistency.
But hang on.
If you're doing that, are you going to send a proper deterrent to people who are sex offenders?
But I
are you
think
going to send a proper deterrent to people
I
who
think
are...
those sentences which were comparable with the 2011 riots that we had in London, which really threatened to get out of control and spread to other cities.
Look, my point is, why have people not been even charged for smashing up and beating up and flooring and breaking the bones of police officers?
That's a separate case.
It's not a separate issue.
It is in the sense that it's a separate case.
It's about consistency and trust in the system.
Different sentences for rioting, that would be two-tier. But what we're talking about is a separate case entirely that's been investigated by the police that hasn't even been brought to the courts yet.
And look, I'm sympathetic to your argument on that, but I've learned through bitter experience when you see these videos and they look as if it's a cast iron case that, well, these people should be arrested, charged and banged up. There's often something that you haven't seen in the video that the police still have to take into account. So, as I say,
4 months, 5 months, really?
My heart is with you, but then my head says, well, you never know. But
if you accept that, you frankly accept the state this country is in. The place is, so much doesn't work because there's a lack of common sense in parts of the public sector at, getting stuff done. And whether it's the NHS, whether it's the justice system, there's just too much where it's acceptable to take way too long.
Right. Well, we're going to move on to a very important subject. I've said that every break so far, haven't I? But we really are this time. We're going to be talking about the right to assisted dying, which Jonathan Romain has very strong views on. In fact, I'm sure you all probably do. It's 8:47.
This is LBC.
The plant.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
10 to 9 on LBC. After 9 o'clock, we're going to be talking about osteoporosis. Yesterday was World Osteoporosis Day. New research suggests that more than 7 million people across England could be in chronic pain by 2040. I want to know what your experiences of living with osteoporosis are, and indeed chronic pain. We have Craig Jones, Chief Executive of the Royal Osteoporosis Society, coming in, and also Sarah Leland, who is a specialist osteoporosis nurse who can give some very good advice. Right, we have with us in the Cross Question studio Emily Thornberry, Richard Tice, Justine Greening and Dr. Jonathan Romain. A text question here from Emma in Ipswich. The right to assisted dying is obviously important, but don't there also need to be assurances that the right to good palliative care is also promised? Good palliative care is something which still needs a lot of work. As someone with stage 4 cancer, I don't want one to come at the cost of another. Jonathan Romain.
Well, she's right on both counts. The reason why assisted dying is such a public issue at the moment is because so many people, unfortunately, die badly. There are lots of beautiful deaths, gentle deaths, but there's an awful lot of people, whether it's with cancer, motor neuron, Parkinson, you can continue the list, who actually die in great pain. And the answer, and the question is, if there is another option, why shouldn't they have it? Now, palliative care is one option, but there's some people who just don't want to endure the last 6 months in pain or agony, and at the moment they don't have any options. Well, they can suffer on, they can commit suicide, but that's often botched and leaves them worse off, or it's awful for the neighbours if they, the relatives, if they succeed, or they can go off to Switzerland and have it there, but that means you have to be wealthy enough to achieve it. So what we want to do, when I say we, I say Dignity in Dying, which I'm the chair of the Religious Alliance, because although there are people like Justin Welby who are very much against it, there's actually a lot of people of faith, both clergy and laity, who are in favour, because we want to give people options. And by the way, the assisted side doesn't mean that somebody else does it to you. It means that you get a prescription from your doctor that allows you to take a life-ending medication if you so wish.
Not if you've got MND, it doesn't.
No.
By definition, at that stage of the disease, you couldn't take it yourself.
Correct. And there are 3 red lines really to do with the safeguards issue. One is that you have to be terminally ill, not depressed in your 40s, but terminally ill, you're dying. So it's not about shortening life, it's about shortening death. Secondly, you have to be mentally competent, so it would rule out someone with Alzheimer's or dementia. And thirdly, it has to be of your own free will. And although some people think, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to society? Actually, we know exactly what's going to happen, because this system, the British system, has been in Oregon for the last 25 years. In other words, we've actually got a quarter of a century's experience of what happens. And actually what happens is that most people carry on to their dying breath, but for those people who want to let go gently, they have that option. And there's a lot of people, interestingly enough, who actually get the permission to have the medication, but don't actually take it up. They want to almost have it as a sort of emotional safety net, so if things go pear-shaped, they can do so. There's also a lot of misinformation about slippery slope. Actually, the Parliamentary Health and Social Care Committee recently said, no, there is not a slippery slope. There are wider jurisdictions.
Canada, hasn't there?
Well, no, because Canada has a totally different system. What happened was that the courts overruled their parliament. Here, it can't do that. The courts can advise, but they can throw back legislation.
Justine can think of an occasion when a court has overruled parliament, because she was involved in it. When Boris prorogued Parliament and the Supreme Court found against him, so that doesn't really work, does it?
That was a constitutional matter. In terms of law, if the law was to be changed, it would only be because MPs did change it. And by the way, the other misinformation is about disability. There's a worry about people disabled. Actually, disabled people are not terminally ill, as we know from the Paralympics.
I think it's right that this comes back before Parliament. The last time it was before Parliament, I think Emily and I were both in Parliament at that time. I certainly remember the debate very well. I was more open-minded on that debate than I'd perhaps expected. My casework was very split 50-50. The issue that time was really the lack of proper safeguards, and I think when you literally looked at this draft bill, it was so far away from something that you thought would be secure, you literally couldn't take it forward. I think both medical science and that what was going on in Oregon at that time was still quite new. And I think the fact you've now got decade plus more evidence, I think the debate in Britain is much more mature on this. I think there's been much more time to think about how to handle some of the genuine, serious concerns that many people have. So I do hope that there can be a sensible debate on this. My sense is Parliament should be working a legislative route. It can't be right that people have to leave the country and, in a sense, put themselves in a completely different setting to take what is such an important decision for them and their family.
Did you vote against last time?
I voted against
and
because
so
actually...
now sounds as if you'd vote in favour.
I'm saying I would go back in open-minded. I would look at what my casework was saying, but I would go back in open-minded and, in a sense, look to see whether this could be done effectively this time, and last time it couldn't.
Emily?
I find this a very difficult issue. I mean, in my heart, I think that you should be able to make a decision about when to end your life, and it shouldn't be hard, and people who care around you shouldn't get into trouble for helping you. That is the kind of where I start. But then there are so many complicating other areas. You know, we began this discussion tonight with we need to have options because dying is so terrible in Britain, because so many people die in pain because the help isn't good enough. And that's, I mean, I agree with you, and that is so wrong, and it frightens me. You know, it frightens me that we might pass legislation when we haven't. We've done so little to improve palliative care in this country. I think that most people...
Surely it's both and. Surely you should do both.
I agree with you, but what worries me is that reality is that we pass this legislation and we don't do anything about the palliative care.
But it would be equally wrong not to pass legislation because the palliative care isn't there.
I mean, I understand. I mean, I think most people, if we had a real debate about this, we should include, would you like to be able to die at home, looked after, so that, you know, your relatives would know that at 4 a.m. you were in terrible pain, there would be someone there to help ease that pain. And if we could, towards the end of our lives, you'd be able to die at home, looked after by those who love us and not in pain, then I think fewer people would even think about the possibility.
We're slightly running out of time, so I want to bring in Richard.
Of killing themselves.
It's a very personal issue. It's a very emotive issue. It's not a party political issue. I'm very struck by what Justine said about the last debate. Look, on balance, having seen someone very close to me die in horrific agony and terrible pain, you know, I'm in favour, but of course it has to be subject to the quality of the safeguards. It does strike me that with our legal expertise in this country, we should be able to build those safeguards in. And what I would quite favour, and I think we should genuinely talk about in Parliament, is a sunset clause. So whether it's after 2 or 3 years, to have a formal, in a sense, it drops away unless Parliament says, actually, we've got this right, or we need to tweak it and adjust it. But I'm also struck by the casework, what the constituents feel. At the moment, the balance of my casework is fairly strongly in favour. But that might change.
Let's give people options. That's what it's about, rather than saying, I don't believe in it, therefore you can't have it.
Isn't this, though, an issue where MPs should lead and not follow their post-bag?
Well, I wonder because I think it is a personal issue, and we've all had different emotive things, and I think it's one of those things that I think we should listen, see what the mood of the people is.
It's not like it's some kind of referendum on it, but it is so important on such a sensitive issue to listen to what your local community thinks, and just that weight of opinion does kind of give you a sense of where people are. But the, you know, what you really need is an end of life strategy.
Not a delegate, aren't they?
Yes, I'm just saying, I just think this particularly matters, but I think what you really need in Britain is an end-of-life care strategy that includes palliative care, and possibly looking at whether this could be part of it too.
Just time for our final question. It's a text question from Benjamin in Manchester. It turns out that King Conker did win the World Conker Championship fairly and didn't use a steel nut to smash the competition. No, me neither. Which niche hobby do you have? Richard?
I did have a hobby of throwing myself down an ice chute at 80 miles an hour called the Cresta Run in my 20s and 30s.
Did you?
But I sensibly, when I crashed very badly, I realised that maybe it was time to stop.
Emily? Beat that?
I get marched around castles in England and Scotland and
you
Wales
enjoy every minute,
and Ireland.
don't you?
Oh, I love it.
The enthusiasm not in her
Pulling a
voice.
face.
Justine.
Slightly weird, different one actually, which is a few years ago my mum was moving house, and so I turned on the right move alert. I can't stop it. So what is that?
Well, even though you're not looking to move.
No, it's exactly. Nothing's going on, and yet I still find them quite interesting. I feel like I need help.
I think we all agree. Jonathan.
I think one of millions of people.
Well, this isn't niche. It's walking the dog, but not just because it keeps me fit, but because that way I actually get to meet the neighbours. And they always chat to the dog, and then eventually they realise there's a lead and a hound and a person at the top of it. And there's other people in my road who don't know each other, but because I walk the dog, I know everybody.
Well, my niche hobby is My niche hobby is following West Ham, which is
That's very niche. Very niche indeed.
Indeed. Thank you all for coming in today. Really great pleasure to have you on the programme. Tomorrow's panel includes the Conservative MP George Freeman, Public Law Barrister Dr Sam Fowles, the Labour MP Jake Richards, and the political strategist Joe Tanner. That's at 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. And of course, if you missed Cross Question, you can always catch up on the LBC YouTube channel, Global Player, or indeed the Cross Question podcast. In the next hour, we're going to talk about osteoporosis because it was World Osteoporosis Day yesterday. And part of the reason I want to talk about it is because we did this, sometime last year. It got a huge reaction, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. And the reason we did it last year was because